your
Thank you very
perspective?
much for the invitation to participate in this forum and this panel. Just to describe EBRD very quickly for those of you who don't know us, we tend to refer to ourselves as a global institution with a European heart. We are majority owned by the European Union and the Commission, but we have a very significant non-EU shareholding of close to 45% in EBRD. We are very much focused on Western Balkans as a big priority, and we invest approximately 1.3 billion euros a year in this region. My job as the head of EBRD for this country is to try to make sure that I take as much of that 1.3 billion euro for North Macedonia, which I think goes against the concept of competitiveness versus competition that the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, but such is life. Even in multilaterals, we tend to be competitive. Moving on to competitiveness, I think Matteo covered very much in detail what we jointly do, because ourselves, EIB and the EU, cooperate a lot on the infrastructure side, whether this is the traditional one or whether this is the green infrastructure. I will focus a little bit more on the private sector and SMEs, because it's a big priority for us. Our shareholders have mandated that over the next strategy period, which is 2021-25, EBRD needs to do about 75% of its investments in the private sector. When you look at the Western Balkans in terms of competitiveness, I think the countries vis-à-vis each other can rank a little bit above or below, but they have something which is very much in common. They do tend to trail their European counterparts by a significant amount, and they have substantial catching up to do. Matteo mentioned the GDP per capita figures. Western Balkans is about, the countries are more or less there vis-à-vis each other, but they're at 1/3 of the EU average, which is quite a big gap to close. And then it's important when you look at it from a competitiveness perspective, because unless our businesses are competitive, they can not essentially integrate in the global value chains and then fight for market share with their European and global counterparts. I think what is important first is to look at the regional integration. I think in this respect, after the Sofia summit last year, a lot of attempts have been made to advance the agenda of a common regional market. I think this is very important because it's the first big step. It's a little bit like if I am to use a football analogy, since everybody played more or less this week with varying hopes and success for the World Cup qualifiers. First you play a Balkan Championship and then you get to play in the European Championship, kind of. I think this is important. It's even more important when you look at it from the perspective of the SMEs, which make up 95% or more of the business in the region, and which usually face bigger competitive pressures than, let's say, the more established, bigger businesses. I mentioned SMEs specifically for two reasons. One is they may not provide the lion's share of GDP, but they do provide the lion's share of employment. In North Macedonia, for example, this is more than 3/4 of employment. Number two is because these are the businesses that employ our youth, and I focus on youth because they are the ones with bigger aspirations. They are usually the energetic ones, the risk takers, and they are the ones that risk running away if they can't find a good opportunity at home. And this is basically what we need to keep here. If we lose our youth, I think the damage, long-term damage to the region is going to be much bigger than losing an infrastructure project or some advanced money or some grant money. In terms of that, and looking at the challenges that the SMEs and private businesses face, we do make our surveys every couple of years, and the last one from 2019 indicated that the biggest challenge is actually the informal economy. It can vary from country to country in the Western Balkans. Some countries, people estimate it closer to 20%, in some countries closer to 40%, but in North Macedonia, for example, a quarter of the respondents put this at the top of the list as the biggest competitive challenge they face from unfair competition. 35% of those actually said this is a severe obstacle to them developing their business, which does underscore the fact that basically we need to do a better job, I think, in legislative informants and improve our governance in the region. The second big challenge, and I think this is the easier one, as we mentioned, was access to finance. Here, I think, in the traditional sense, we can throw plenty of money to the problem. Ambassador Geer in the previous panel mentioned the 30 billion plan of EU. I mentioned what EBRD tends to do annually, and Matteo can throw the EIB figures. We do get a lot of EU support for our programs in the form of grants for both investments and technical assistance. So that I think is the easier part to address. But we need to be creative on how we channel this towards competitiveness, because just throwing money at the problem also doesn't help. One thing, for example, that we have done for the region is a specific SME competitiveness facility. It's 350 million euros, and it was essentially taken up in 2 years. And we focus on environmental protection, product safety and quality, and health and safety, because we identified these as 3 of the key reasons which would make the enterprises more competitive vis-a-vis their regional peers, but also EU players. The third problem that I think the region faces, and I think it was also mentioned by the previous panelists, is the labor skill mismatch. And about 15% of our respondents indicated this as the third biggest and severe obstacle in being competitive. When I came to North Macedonia first, I was a bit surprised to hear by some of my counterparts that the country has more licensed universities than high schools. That usually indicates that we need to do something in terms of the educational reform, because it is not possible that we need more university graduates than high school trainees, people with specific skills, etc. And that kind of, and even those universities were producing, let's say, an output, for lack of a better word, which was geared towards 1 or 2 fields. This type of sort of like labor skill mismatch is a big cost to the employers, and is a big problem. Again, I go back to my favorite topic of youth, because our survey indicates that about 1/3, actually, of the youth in our countries is either undereducated or educated for the kind of jobs that the employers are looking for. So this is very important. Now, throwing money at the problem, as I said, is one thing. Doing some soft reforms, whether this is in terms of the business climate, in terms of regional cooperation, like we have with the Western Balkans registry, business registry portal, or the Western Balkan 6 Chambers of Investment Forum. This is one thing that you can look at, and of course both the EIB and us and the EU, we work a lot to support this type of activities. I think the other thing which is important for long-term competitiveness is to actually try to think differently and a little bit, for lack of a better word, again, my apologies, a little bit smarter. Western Balkans have been very good at attracting FDI, and North Macedonia has been at the forefront. But it is oftentimes, this is very labor-intensive FDI. This will not help create long-term advantage. I think what is important is to try to focus on attracting FDI also on the higher value-added sectors, and try to make sure that this type of technology and skills that is generated by this type of investment then spills over to the business and the larger economy. The second part, with 3 sub-bullets, is, I think, the necessity to upgrade the infrastructure, because this helps both generate jobs, but also makes our businesses more competitive in the long term. And I'm not thinking here of the traditional infrastructure, building the roads and the railroads and the border crossings that we do so well already, although we could do better, I think, in terms of implementation. I'm thinking of 3 things, really. One is the green part, which Matteo mentioned. We need our infrastructure and our economies to be more energy efficient and more decarbonized. I'm an energy banker by my background, so my interest in my previous life was to tell all of my clients, just build more capacity, do bigger networks, do bigger transmission lines, etc. And yet I would tell them that the cheapest energy, whether it costs 30 euros per megawatt hour or 200 in the market, the cheapest energy is the one that you don't use. So energy efficiency is important. Decarbonization, I don't want to focus on too much because of the price.
Can we just draw your remark to a close, just because we've got very little time for the questions?
So decarbonization, I won't go on because we know the price of carbon these days. 2 other things. One is basically digitalization, which everyone mentioned. Digital infrastructure is very important. The other one is to support innovative technologies, because having an advantage in let's say, in cheaper labor, in mid-skilled labor, etc., can very easily be overtaken by automation and higher technologies, and we know how fast the world evolves these days. So we need to make sure that we import and support more innovative technologies and have them in our countries.